So, we want to keep going and talking about regulation in the real world. Remember that there are all these agencies. There's kind of a three-letter tradition in the U.S. government from Franklin D. Roosevelt, who named every agency on the planet Earth as three letters. But these agencies are under the executive branch. Congress makes the laws. The executive branch agencies create the regulations under which those laws exist. The best-selling book of the 1960s is this book, Silent Spring by Rachel Carson. It's what started really the environmental movement in the United States. And really what's important from there is the story of a pesticide called DDT. DDT is responsible for almost wiping out the bald eagle, almost wiping out the California condor. Birds exposed to DDT, again, farmers spray DDT across their farms. Birds breathe it in. Birds who have been exposed to DDT lay eggs that have really brittle shells, so brittle that when the bird sits on the shell to nest, it breaks the egg and kids die. Almost wiped out the bald eagle, almost wiped out the California condor. We create rules and regulations, ban DDT. Two things happen. One is we replace DDT with pesticides that are just as dangerous or more dangerous to humans, and you should wash your apples because eating apples is bad. There's a list every year of dangerous, really dangerous pesticides on fruits and what fruits you need to be careful of. At the same time, the manufacturers of DDT didn't want to stop using it. They couldn't sell it in Europe. They couldn't sell it in the United States. So they started selling it in Africa. And if you know anything about Africa, or the southern part of Africa, the southern hemisphere, the winds blow the other way. DDT in southern Africa blows across into South America and then up into North America, and so we're still sometimes plagued by DDT. A side thing besides all the consequences, and remember what I'm trying to do here is not say good or bad. I'm trying to point out that there's always pluses and minuses. There's always new problems and new concerns that are caused by dealing with old problems and old concerns. We have a concept called regulatory capture. And what that means is that very often the company who's being regulated takes over the process. Who gives the most money to political campaigns? Healthcare industry and Wall Street. Do they have some control, at least some say, over the laws that govern their operations? Yes, they do, and we'll talk about some of that. That guy over there, remember, is James Buchanan. He's the one that told us, look, people are going to maximize their own well-being. And not other people told us that before, but in the political world, this process still works. That you have to look at the political world not as people who are there trying to do right by society, but ultimately people are trying to fulfill their own goals, try to be what they can be. So this regulatory capture, it's a very important concept. Whoever is being regulated will try to seize the process, will try to pervert, if you will, the process so that instead of the government telling them what to do, they tend to tell the government what to do. If you're board here, Nevada, we need to talk about Nevada. We're going to talk about Nevada off and on, and we have a little bit, and then we're going to talk about Nevada heavy at the end. Nevada Constitution, and I'm not going to explain this, But Nevada Constitution is regulatory capture. The whole Constitution is about regulatory capture. More than any other state, more than any other part of our universe, regulatory capture lives in the Nevada Constitution. I'm going to give you two examples from Nevada. One is the Public Utilities Commission. There's a regulatory agency that controls things like taxi cabs and buses and that kind of thing. There was a gentleman who wanted to put a trolley system up and down the strip. Really buses, but they looked like old school trolleys, and drive them up and down the strip. And he demonstrated that there was a need for this, that it wasn't being satisfied. The state rejected his application, said it wasn't needed. A month later, the taxi cab companies put in a trolley system, and they basically just stole the guy's idea, and it was approved because there was a need. Regulatory capture, pure and simple. The Gaming Control Board also controlled foreign ownership for years. They wouldn't let foreign companies in to compete against the companies that were already here because supposedly it was too hard to check them out, to do a background check on foreign ownership. And the Gaming Control Board also was used to control Howard Hughes when he was here and trying to kind of take over the strip. So we have these examples. On the other hand, the other side of this, or another side of this, is our buddy Ronald Coase that we talked about a minute ago. And he was just anti-regulation of any kind. Anti-regulation of agriculture, anti-zoning, anti-everything. And he says there are so many studies and the results are always bad. That's not true. There are half the studies say that it's bad and half the studies say that it's good. Zoning laws mean that the guy, my next door neighbor, can't tear his house down and put in a bar and leave me to have to deal with, a bar as a neighbor. I have a house as a neighbor. I'm always going to have a house as a neighbor. Zoning laws protect me from things that might happen. We know that casinos lower the value of houses. Houses that are within a half-a-mile casino have lower value than houses that are further out. Zoning can protect us from that. So we can have examples that are good and bad. The Fed originally was a really good example of regulatory capture. The Fed was set up by interests that are friendly with J.P. Morgan. It was originally set up so that the board of the Federal Reserve was the Secretary of Treasury and other appointees, and the original Fed was captured by the banking industry, by certain elements of the banking industry. What happened was, for the first 20 years the Fed existed, we had inflation. We had probably the worst bout of sustained inflation in American history. The Fed was inflating the currency. It was doing things not only that the banking people wanted, but also, strangely, that the progressives wanted, because they're anti-gold and they're in favor of trying to help out the farmers. And so this inflation was supported by both kind of the far right and the far left of politics at the time. And then the Fed screws up the Depression. So what we see is the modern Federal Reserve that comes out of the 1930s that is now independent. And we've had much lower inflation since the Fed was remodeled and separated and made independent than we had when it was captured and controlled at its beginning. When we changed the Fed so that the Secretary of the Treasury is not there, so that people get appointed and they're independent and they serve for 14 years and all of this, we created the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, which has independent voices, not just the Board of Governors, but it has a majority of independent voices that aren't part of that regulatory structure. We get an entirely different Federal Reserve. Related to all this is also what happened during the Great Depression. After the Great Depression collapses, we get a law called the Glass-Steagall Act, and that's Carter Glass there. He is largely responsible for the Federal Reserve law inside the Senate. He put it through. And in 1934, he wrote actually several acts, but we call them a Glass-Steagall Act, that restricted banking activities. It separated out the stock market from the banks. Where we used to have banks and the stock markets all tied together, it separated stock market, banks, and actually the housing market too, the mortgage market, separated them out. In the 70 so years that Glass-Steagall was in effect, the United States did not suffer a single financial panic. We averaged one every 20 years. Before Glass-Steagall, during the 70 years of Glass-Steagall, we had none. So we had 4 in the 100 years before Glass-Steagall, none, 0 in the 70 years of Glass-Steagall, and 1 in the first 10 years after Glass-Steagall was repealed. We did banking deregulation. We had 3 laws, the 1980 law, 1984 law, and 1999 law. The 1999 law is called Gramm-Leach-Bliley, passed the Senate 90-8, passed the House with 362 of 435, only 50-some representatives voted against it, written by 3 Republicans, signed into law by Bill Clinton, the Democrat, voted for by just about everybody, and most people would say that that law is the single most important thing that then led to the 2007-2008 financial collapse, because that law allowed derivatives to go wild. We'd had derivatives before, financial derivatives, but not to that extent. Trying to get caught up here. Not to that extent. And then, strangely enough, Gramm-Leach-Bliley forbids the Securities Exchange Commission from creating regulations to prevent problems coming from financial derivatives. Okay? So we have the Affordable Health Care Act. The problem, as an economist, from my point of view with the Affordable Care Act, is that it was written basically by the healthcare side, not by the consumer side. It attacks demand for healthcare, not supply of healthcare. The way to get the prices of healthcare down is to have more doctors, more choice, more information, more transparency, and we get none of that from the Affordable Health Care Act. What we get is consumer side issues. We get higher deductibles and really more interesting outcomes. The U.S. pays twice as much as European countries, as Germany or France do for their health care, twice as much per person for the health care, and we get the same outcomes. The quality of outcome in the U.S. is no better than in Europe, and we pay twice as much because we're going after the demand, not the supply. In all of these regulations, the executive branch of the United States is forbidden by Congress from negotiating drug prices. Medicare is this huge body of people and this huge buying power. They should be able to drive down drug prices, except that Congress has forbidden them from negotiating drug prices. Forbidden them from negotiating drug prices. Congress should be taking care of the population, should be looking after senior citizens on Medicare, but they have forbidden Medicare from negotiating down drug prices. We are interested in playing with demand, not working on supply. We should understand as economists that the most effective way to create affordable health care is through supply. So is the Affordable Health Care Act constitutional? Well, the Supreme Court went not just a little bit out on the limb to say it was constitutional, they went way out on the limb to say it was constitutional. And they did that only by saying that it's constitutional because the requirement in it is a tax, and Congress has the power to tax and therefore can tie this all to a tax. Congress last year got rid of the tax, and now the Trump administration has gone to court trying to get the whole entire Affordable Care Act thrown out as unconstitutional because there's no longer a tax that's part of it. So they want to get rid of protection for pre-occurring illnesses, that kind of thing. Okay? Romney Care, Mitt Romney right there, when he was governor of Massachusetts, they put in a statewide healthcare system, a universal care, Romney Care it's called in Massachusetts, and it works just fine. The reason that it works is that everybody's in the system. Healthcare can't ever be affordable if you get to pick and choose whether you're in the system or not in the system. We have car insurance, and what happens is for every 10 people who pay in and don't have an accident, they pay in extra money to cover the one person who has an accident. And that way everybody's premium is reasonable. The only way you get reasonable healthcare premiums is to have everybody in the system so that the healthy people pay in more than they spend, and we collect the extra money from the healthy people and we spend it on the sick people. The problem with the Affordable Care Act, or one of the problems with the Affordable Care Act, without the tax requirement, is not everybody's in the system.